Hey, greetings and welcome to week 1. This is lecture 2. In lecture 1, we started with a clearly defined why. I think that is essential. We have to name that we understand the why behind what we do. The kingdom is at hand, we're called to bear witness to it, and we're supposed to live in an unashamed posture. And that is powerful in of itself. But once we clarify the why, then we have to acknowledge that in the current context that we find ourselves in the West, that mission and mandate of Jesus has become increasingly difficult. There are challenges, there are crises, and there is some scarcity that is creating all sorts of concerns for the church about how we are to live out our mission day to day. Now, we're going to be talking in this class about how do we move to this sense of movement of the mission. So I'm going and starting at the place of challenges, complexity, chaos, the disarray that the church finds itself on. But then we're moving towards this hope-filled belief that the church can again be a movement. There's a slide on your presentations, and it's called Surveying the Landscape. There's a great quote here that I really appreciate. The first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you, and in between, the leader is a servant. I think that's a great quote. The first responsibility of the leader is to name and define reality. We have to come to terms with the current situation that we are in. And that's something that I think leaders don't often make enough time to do, which is to name their current reality. They must step back from the trees long enough to see the forest. We have to care enough to take a deep dive into the environmental factors that limit our churches or organizations' effectiveness currently in the world that we live in. We have to cultivate a practice of regularly assessing the emerging trends all around us. Do we know enough about our culture when our culture shifts that the church is nimble enough to adapt and to resonate with those adaptations and changes that are taking place all around us? Can we speak a relevant word into those ever-changing situations? And one of the things I want to remind us of is that one of the factors that make us leaders is the capacity to see down the road further than those that we lead. And I think that's essential for us to remember. And we have to be willing, and this is, when you define reality, you are courageously naming unpopular and non-preferred realities. Most of our people would love to bury their head in the sand. They want to be comforted that in the way they see the world, the way they believe the world to be, that's the way it is. And at times we are called to bear witness to this kingdom of God in a world that demands the courage to be able to name that the truths that people have, the assumptions that people have made, are not quite adequate to assess where we are in the world today. That we have to name courageously the realities that might rub up against existing power structures and organizational assumptions. That is key for us in this process. So I've given you a list in your PowerPoint, and I want to invite you to look. Now, I want you to understand that this list isn't exhaustive, okay? I wanted to name reality for us. I wanted to assess that given the current cultural context and climate we find ourselves in, what are some of the factors, external and internal, that are impacting the church's capacity to be effective in this moment and to move towards its movemental nature within the life of the church. Some of the external factors that you and I are very aware of. We are living in a time of absolute political dividedness, and that finds its way around us as the church, but also what we find is that it moves into the church. And that political divisiveness always seems to couch the questions and conversations we are having within a language of whatever side of the aisle that person is coming from. So the political divide is an issue. Racial injustice, we're seeing this epic historical moment in which I think for the first time in a really long time, the church is having to wrestle with its failure and complicity to name the sinfulness of racial injustice, racial inequality, and racial bias. And I think this is a moment for the church to right some wrongs, but it comes couched in a huge conversation about the nature of words like Black Lives Matter and what does that mean for the church. Let's not forget COVID-19. COVID-19 became an external factor that catapulted the church into this sense of crisis. If the entire model of church is to gather on a Sunday morning and you can't gather, what does that mean for us? Post-Christianization of certain segments of our country, where the gospel has fallen out of parlance of our language, right? Where it's out of vogue. So we're living in this increasingly post-Christian culture. The globalization and ease of movement of people, where we are no longer isolated in our little groups because of technology, because of mass migration, we find ourselves ever expanding our horizons and being able to see the world from different perspectives and empathize with people in different ways. And we have access to different kinds of truths that maybe in parochial settings we wouldn't have had, and that influences and impacts the way in which the church understands its truth, its postures, its positions, its stances, and the way in which it understands itself in a pluralistic culture. And that where pluralism can be defined either descriptively, we're around a lot of different people, or prescriptively, that there is no one claim to truth, and that we are all on the same path and we have equal validity in our religious truths. Those are the external factors. Now let's look at some internal factors. Internal factors impacting the church's effectiveness. Things like shrinking attendance. There's a sense of feeling like the church is dying in America. Shrinking budgets. We're broke. Traditionalism. Now, I don't mean the great tradition of the church. I mean traditionalism. When we become enmeshed in the contextual ways that we've done church at given times, and we've seen those contextual ways of only doing church that way for the rest of our time of doing church. Fundamentalisms, when we become so entrenched in our truth, we become angry if there's any threat to our perceived understanding of our reduced sense of truths, our seeming irrelevance, that we have this fear that as the world changes around us, the church doesn't speak a relevant word to it. Failure of trusted models. There were things that we could put into place, things that we could do, we knew would provide a sense of predictable outcomes, and those don't seem to be providing those things any longer. The distrust of leadership. If you're a pastor, you know what it means to preach to a people who are listening to all sorts of other voices all throughout the week. And no matter what you say, gospel inclined, people are going to question you based upon which eye-old pundit they listened to the day before, whether they got their news from MSNBC or whether they got their news from Fox News. And you are being measured against the pundits that they trust more than you. There's this sense of political division within our churches, that pastors, their sermons, the people in the church are being held captive by the belief that the church ought to serve some sort of political platform other than the kingdom of God. Now, we are participants in this world, don't get me wrong, but we need to understand that the kingdom of God is our primary allegiance. Remember, that's the why. And then we're dealing with a set of conspiracy theories. Now, let me make this clear before I bring an end to this particular lecture. We've been trained to tackle one issue at a time. If we have a problem, we jump in. If we have a budget issue, we convene a committee, we tackle it, we go to the congregation, we talk about that. But what happens, and this is where complexity comes in, which we'll define more clearly next week. What happens when you're not dealing with a problem? What happens when all of your problems are enmeshed together? What happens if you're having a budget crisis at the same time as COVID-19 hits, and you can no longer meet to have your committee meeting to talk about your budget and to raise funds from people who aren't at your church anymore, at the same time that there's this racial injustice piece that hits, and you took a stance on Facebook that now some of the people who were in your church disagreed and they stepped out, further entrenching this budgetary crisis, calling into question your leadership because now you're not trusted as one of those voices. That is how these issues are interwoven into the life of the church, and that creates a dynamic of complexity and, for some of us, crisis. And we need to understand, we need to be able to name those realities, and then we need to be able to dream and innovate and imagine a way forward through those realities, because God's not dissuaded or discouraged by the realities that we face. The kingdom of God still prevails. This still goes on. We just need to align ourselves creatively with the kingdom of God in this ever-changing world that we are in. And we're going to talk about how to do that, but we'll lean a little further into that in the next lecture.